what if the reason our political systems feel like they're just constantly on the verge of collapse isn't actually because of bad policies?
Right, or bad politicians even.
Yeah, exactly. What if it's because of, like, bad physics?
Which is a wild thought to start with.
It really is. But, do you ever look around at the state of the world today? Like the gridlock, the institutional decay, just the sheer unpredictability of everything you read in the news, and you feel like we're trying to navigate a Category 5 hurricane using like a child's crayon drawing of the ocean.
That's exactly what it feels like, yeah.
We're using these maps that suggest the world works one specific way, but the storm we're actually standing in is governed by completely different rules.
And I mean, it's this profound sense of disorientation, right, that seems to just be defining our entire current era. People can feel that the maps no longer match the territory.
Yeah, they feel it in their bones.
Right, but they don't have the vocabulary to explain why, so they just, keep trying to fold the map differently, hoping it's going to suddenly reveal this safe path.
And that feeling of disorientation, that is our starting point today. So, welcome to this deep dive. Today, we are taking you on just a massive intellectual journey.
It's a big one.
It really is. We've got this huge stack of excerpts in front of us from Elias Kunis's 2025 book, Aliveness, Principles of Telic Systems. And our mission today is to completely unpack what Kunis presents as this grand, unified theory of everything.
Which is, I mean, it's incredibly ambitious.
Oh, totally. We're going to go from the thermodynamics of a single biological cell to the rise and fall of global civilizations, all the way to, like, the future of artificial intelligence, and then finally right down into the psychology of your own mind.
Yeah, what Kunis is ultimately attempting to do here is establish almost like a physics of goal-directed systems. He really wants to understand the underlying, just non-negotiable mechanics of why complex systems survive, why they thrive, and why they inevitably collapse.
And his starting premise, like the absolute bedrock of the book, is that our traditional political compass is just fundamentally broken. That standard left versus right, liberal versus conservative spectrum we all use to, argue about politics, he argues it's dangerously obsolete.
It's totally insufficient for the problems we're facing.
Right. Now, I want to be incredibly clear to you listening right now. The source material we're looking at contains these massive sweeping critiques of both left-wing and right-wing paradigms. And in this deep dive, we are remaining strictly impartial.
Absolutely.
We are not endorsing any political side or taking any ideological stance whatsoever. We are purely reporting on these concepts as Kunis's theoretical analysis of structural failure, just conveying the ideas from the text.
And his audit of both sides of that traditional compass is, I mean, it's quite clinical. He argues that both right-wing and left-wing paradigms fail for the exact same underlying reason, actually.
Which is what?
They ignore the actual unyielding physical constraints of reality. So, for instance, he points out that the traditional right often demands both radical, destructive free market capitalism and traditional, stable family values simultaneously.
Oh, interesting.
Right, and in his view, that is a thermodynamic contradiction. You literally cannot subject a society to the relentless, churning creative destruction of hyper-capitalism and then expect the local communities and family structures within it to just remain perfectly stable and untouched.
Because the energy dynamics they don't allow for it.
Exactly. The energy required to adapt to the market completely destabilizes the homeostasis of the family.
Wow. And he applies that exact same physical audit to the left.
He does, yeah. He argues the left often demands both total, top-down bureaucratic control of the economy and radical individual emancipation simultaneously.
Which is, yeah, that's an organizational impossibility.
Exactly. From a systems engineering perspective, it doesn't work. You can't build a structure that requires immense centralized conformity to function while simultaneously maximizing the chaotic, boundary-breaking agency of every single individual within it.
So he views the traditional political compass not just as flawed, but as, I think he calls it an accident of history.
Yeah, dating back to the literal seating arrangements in the French Revolution.
Right. So it's entirely untethered from the physics of how complex systems actually operate in the real world.
Exactly.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because if the old map is a crayon drawing, what's the new map? We can't just throw away the old compass without a replacement.
Right, you need new coordinates.
Yeah. So to understand why the old compass is broken, we have to look at the new coordinates. Kunis proposes to actually measure a civilization, and he calls this the sort framework. SORT.
The SORT framework, yeah.
And it's his new way to look at he calls it the axiological source code, like the core operating values of a society.
Yeah, so the SORT framework is his alternative to that left-right spectrum. He proposes these 4 fundamental dimensions that every complex system, and we mean whether it's a bacterial colony or a massive nation state, they all have to navigate these.
Let's walk through them because they form the foundational grammar for literally everything else we're going to talk about today.
Yeah.
So the first is S, which stands for sovereignty or boundary.
Right, and this is basically the tension between agency and communion. So where do you draw the line of the self that you're actually trying to protect?
Okay, so think about it like where the system places its ultimate locus of value.
Exactly. Is your society geared toward the absolute sovereignty of the individual unit? That would be pure agency.
Like a radical libertarian ideal.
Right, where the individual is supreme and the collective is just this loose, voluntary association. Or, on the flip side, is the system geared toward the collective?
Which is communion.
Yes, where the individual is fundamentally subordinated to the survival and cohesion of the group.
So like an ancient Spartan polis or, a highly communitarian religious settlement.
Exactly, so that's the S-axis.
Yeah.
Individual versus the group.
Okay, then we move to the second dimension, which is O for organization or control. And this asks a mechanical question. Like, how do we actually build order in this society?
And here we have 2 opposing poles again. So at one pole you have emergence. This is a bottom-up, decentralized, completely spontaneous order. There is no central architect at all.
Like a free market.
A free market is a perfect example where millions of individual decisions create a really complex pricing mechanism. Or think of the evolution of common law, or even just a flock of birds navigating a forest without, like, a lead bird shouting commands.
Right. It just happened.
It emerges. And then the opposite pole, you have design. This is top-down, centralized, architected control.
So a centrally planned command economy,
Right.
a really strict civil code.
Or a highly regimented corporate bureaucracy. Yeah.
That makes intuitive sense. Emergence is a rainforest. Design is a botanical garden.
I love that analogy. Yeah.
So S is individual versus group. O is bottom-up chaos versus top-down planning. Then we get to R, which stands for reality or information. And this axis is fascinating to me because it deals with epistemology. Like, how does a civilization actually know what is true?
Yeah, and the tension here is between mythos and gnosis. So the mythos pole relies on narrative, tradition, inherited wisdom, subjective meaning.
But Kunis is careful to point out that mythos isn't necessarily false, right?
Oh, absolutely not. He says it's highly compressed, historically tested data. A culture's founding myths, its religious traditions, its societal taboos, these contain immense survival value. They give a society its cohesion and purpose without requiring every single individual to, rediscover fire from scratch.
Right, you don't have to test if jumping off a cliff is bad. The myth tells you it's bad.
Exactly. But the gnosis pole operates entirely differently.
Right.
The gnosis pole is pure, empirical, falsifiable, objective truth. It's the scientific method. It requires constantly testing reality, measuring outcomes, and updating your models, regardless of how uncomfortable or destabilizing that new reality might be to the established narrative.
So it's incredibly rigorous, but it provides almost zero inherent meaning or moral direction.
Exactly. It tells you how things are, not what to do about it.
And finally, we have T for telos or time. And this is the ultimate goal of the civilization.
Right. Does it seek homeostasis, which is preservation, safety, comfort, minimizing risk, basically keeping things exactly as they are?
Or does it seek metamorphosis, which is growth, transformation, pushing the boundary, taking massive risks to become something entirely new?
So those 4 axes, sovereignty, organization, reality, and telos, they give you the structural anatomy of a civilization. You can plot any society, historical or modern, somewhere along those 4 spectrums.
But a static snapshot isn't enough to tell you if that society is actually going to survive.
No, it's not. And that's why Kunis introduces the alpha-omega phase space. These are 2 master variables that show how a civilization actually performs when you put it in motion.
Okay, let's define omega and alpha, because in his framework, these basically dictate whether a society lives or dies over the long term.
Right. So omega is state coherence. Think of it as a measurement, essentially from 0 to 1, of a polity's internal alignment. Are all the factions, the institutions, the media, the citizens, are they all rowing in the same direction?
So high omega means tremendous unity.
Unity, high social trust, a shared understanding of reality.
And low omega means severe fragmentation, like internal civil war, high polarization, complete breakdown of trust.
Exactly. And then alpha is the action variable. This is what the system actually does out in the physical world
Right.
with whatever coherence it has.
Is the system syntropic? Meaning, is it creating order, building infrastructure, expanding its capabilities, generating surplus value? That's positive alpha.
Or is it entropic? Is it destroying order, decaying, consuming its own foundational capital just to survive the day? That would be negative alpha.
Which leads to what Kunis calls the iron law of coherence, which states that if your omega is low, if your society is entirely fragmented, polarized, and at war with itself, sustained positive, alpha becomes thermodynamically impossible.
You literally cannot build a cathedral if the masons are actively trying to kill the carpenters.
Wow, yeah. All of the society's metabolic energy just gets burned up in internal friction, leaving zero surplus energy for actual creation or defense.
It's a brutal rule of energy accounting. Internal conflict consumes the energy that would otherwise be used to fight the natural decay of the universe.
Okay, hold on. I need to jump in here and play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
You're saying a political ideology or a society's value system is literally bound by the physics of energy accounting.
That's his argument, yes.
Because right now, I mean, this sounds incredibly elegant, but it also sounds like a giant Myers-Briggs personality test applied to entire countries. Like, oh, America is high agency and high metamorphosis, so it's in ESTJ, and ancient Rome was an INTP.
Right.
How is this actually scientific? Are we just slapping Greek letters on cultural preferences and calling it physics? Give me a concrete reason why this isn't just a clever metaphor.
I mean, it's the necessary skepticism to have, right? If this were just a cultural taxonomy, it would be no better than the left-right compass.
Exactly.
But Kunis insists that SORT is not a psychological profiling tool. He argues that these four axes are not human inventions at all. They're derived from the strict, unyielding physical constraints of energy and information processing in our universe.
Okay, so how does he prove that?
To prove that, he says we have to zoom all the way out from empires and politics and look at the actual physics of reality. We have to go down to the absolute bedrock of thermodynamics to see where these four axes actually come from.
Which takes us to the concept of a telic system. Because before we talk about how physics applies to politics, we have to define the category of things we're actually talking about here.
Right. What makes a society or a human being different from just a rock rolling down a hill?
Right. And Kunis defines a telic system as a goal-directed, negentropic pattern that fights entropy by subordinating thermodynamics to computation.
Which is, I know, that is a very dense definition.
It's a mouthful. So let's break it down using the analogy he provides in the text. He asks us to compare a hurricane to a virus.
Yes. Both are highly complex, self-organizing physical systems. They both move, they both consume energy, they both alter their environment. But they are fundamentally different in their relationship to the universe.
Because a hurricane is a pure thermodynamic engine.
Exactly. It blindly follows energy gradients. It takes the warm water of the ocean and turns it into kinetic energy, specifically to maximize entropy, to dissipate that heat as fast as possible.
It has no goal. It has no internal map of the world. It's just water and temperature flowing downhill, energetically speaking.
Right. But a virus operates on a completely different paradigm.
A virus is a telic system.
Yes. A virus carries a genome, a set of instructions, an internal model of a target state. It subordinates those blind laws of thermodynamics to computation.
It has a computationally defined self that it actively wants to preserve and replicate.
It has a telos, a purpose. It fights the universal decay of entropy by creating local pockets of highly organized complexity, even if it has to destroy its host to do it.
And because a virus or, a bacterium or an ant colony or a human empire is actively fighting entropy to maintain its existence, it's forced to solve physical problems. The universe is constantly trying to pull it apart, so it has to make choices about how to survive.
Right. And Kunis argues there are exactly four inescapable physical problems that any telic system must solve just to exist in our universe.
He calls them the four axiomatic dilemmas. And this is where the SORT framework stops being a personality test and maps perfectly onto physics. Let's walk through these dilemmas, starting with the thermodynamic dilemma.
So the thermodynamic dilemma maps directly to the t-axis of telos. The second law of thermodynamics states that entropy always increases. Things naturally fall apart. To fight this, a system must process energy.
Right.
But here's the physical constraint. Any system has a finite energy budget at any given moment. This forces a non-negotiable choice. Do you allocate your limited energy to maintaining your current boundary, repairing damage, staying safe, achieving homeostasis?
Or do you expend that surplus energy to grow, expand, take risks, and replicate achieving metamorphosis?
Exactly. You literally cannot use the exact same unit of ATP in a cell or the exact same tax dollar in a nation to do both simultaneously.
Oh, wow. So because energy is physically finite, the system literally has to choose between maintaining its walls or expanding its borders. It's a physics budget, not a political preference. That makes total sense.
Yes.
Okay, so the second problem is the boundary dilemma, which generates the S-axis sovereignty.
Right. So if you're a complex system made of smaller parts, like a multicellular organism made of cells, or a society made of citizens, where's the boundary of the self that you're actually trying to preserve?
Do you optimize for the survival and replication of the individual unit,
Think of a single cell maximizing its own replication at the expense of its neighbors.
which is cancer?
Right. Or do you optimize for the collective, requiring the individual to subordinate its energy and maybe even sacrifice itself for the survival of the whole tissue?
That's the tension between agency and communion, derived directly from spatial boundary physics. Okay. Then we have the information dilemma, which gives us the R-axis, reality.
Because to survive in a dangerous universe, a telic system needs a model of the world outside its boundary.
And gathering information is physically expensive.
Incredibly expensive. Building and running sensory organs, whether it's an eye, a radar dish, or a massive particle accelerator, it burns tremendous amounts of metabolic energy.
So the system faces a choice. Does it rely on cheap, pre-compiled historical data encoded in its structure?
Right. For a cell, this is its DNA. For society, this is its inherited cultural mythos. It takes almost no energy to just run the default code.
Or does it expend massive amounts of energy to build active sensory organs to gather high-fidelity real-time data, which is gnosis?
It gives you a more accurate map of the present moment, but it costs a fortune in resources to maintain.
Okay, and finally, the control dilemma, the O-axis organization. Once you have a model of the world, how do you coordinate all your internal parts to take action?
Do you use a centralized top-down command processor, like a brain or a central government, to design the response? Or do you allow bottom-up coordination, where the individual parts follow simple local rules to generate an emergent response?
So by establishing these four physical dilemmas, Carnus does something remarkable here. He basically strips away all the cultural baggage of sociology and politics.
He creates a taxonomy of all possible telic systems, based purely on how their solutions to these four dilemmas affect the complexity of their environment.
And he categorizes them into three fundamental classes. The first class is the parasite, or, in thermodynamic terms, the entropic converter.
Right. This is a system that maintains its own internal order by consuming a higher order system, resulting in a net decrease in total complexity in the universe.
Let's look at the virus crucible from the text to see how this works, because this is where it gets really interesting. A virus has a goal, it replicates. But Kunis argues it's fundamentally undead because its sort signature is pathologically extreme on all four axes in a way that guarantees its own eventual destruction if it's too successful.
Let's audit a virus using the sort framework, S-axis.
Yeah.
It's a pure individualist. It only cares about replicating its own specific code with absolutely zero communion with the host cell.
Right. R-axis. It operates on pure, rigid genetic dogma. It has no real-time sensory adaptation. If the environment changes, it just blindly keeps trying to execute its code.
O-axis. It is purely rigid, deterministic design.
And T-axis. It switches violently from totally dormant homeostasis when it's floating outside a cell to explosive suicidal metamorphosis once inside, just replicating until it bursts the cell and destroys its own resource base.
The virus fails the ultimate tests of what Aquinas calls aliveness. Specifically, it fails fecundity because it destroys the very environment it needs to survive, and it fails synergy because its relationship to the broader world is purely extractive.
It doesn't build anything, it only takes.
Exactly. So the second class of system, by contrast, is the autotroph.
An autotroph maintains complexity.
Yes. Think of a mature climax ecosystem, like an ancient redwood forest that has reached equilibrium. It perfectly maintains its incredible internal complexity, but it is in pure homeostasis.
It doesn't grow outward, it doesn't innovate.
It just exists in a steady, sustainable state, endlessly recycling its own energy.
But the third class is the hero of the book, the syntrope. And the canonical example Kunis uses is ancient cyanobacteria.
Billions of years ago, yeah.
Billions of years ago, before there was complex life on Earth, these tiny bacteria consumed sunlight and CO2, and they produced a toxic waste product, oxygen.
Which actually caused a mass extinction of anaerobic life.
Right, but it also saturated the atmosphere and unlocked the chemical possibility of aerobic respiration. It created the thermodynamic foundation for multicellular life to exist.
A centipede doesn't just extract, and it doesn't just maintain. It actively increases the organized complexity and the creative potential of the universe around it.
That, Kunis says, is the strict physical definition of aliveness.
So we've established that these four constraints, energy, boundary, information, and control, they apply to physical biology, from the virus to the redwood tree. But the book takes a massive leap right here.
Yeah, it does.
If these physical dilemmas apply to a blind biological cell, how does a conscious, intelligent mind experience them? Like, how does intelligence change the equation?
This brings us to what Kunis calls the trinity of tensions. He argues that the moment an entity becomes intelligent, the moment it builds a predictive model of the world in its mind, those four physical problems collapse into exactly three computational problems.
The physical world basically becomes a computational space. So the first tension is the world, the tension between order and chaos. How does a mind model an unpredictable, chaotic reality and coordinate its own actions to impose order within it?
Which computationally fuses the information and control dilemmas.
Exactly. The second tension is time, the tension between the future and the present. How does the intelligence allocate its finite resources across time? Does it consume everything now for present comfort or defer gratification for future transformation?
So this is the thermodynamic dilemma experienced computationally as temporal choice.
Yes. And the third tension is the self, the tension between agency and communion. Where does the mind draw the boundary of what it considers itself versus the other?
And to prove that this trinity of tensions isn't just, human philosophy, Kunis offers what he calls the holographic proof. He argues this specific computational geometry is scale invariant. It applies everywhere, at every level of intelligence.
For example, he points to the work of biologist Michael Levin on morphogenesis.
Detail that for us, because Levin's work is mind-blowing.
Levin's research is foundational to this argument. Levin studies how biological forms actually know what shape to build. Like, how does a collection of embryonic cells know how to build a human hand instead of a foot?
Right.
3.5 billion years ago, long before neurons or brains existed, simple cells were already using bioelectric networks to communicate across tissues. And Levin shows that these cellular collectives face the exact same trinity of tensions.
They have to solve the self-tension.
Exactly. Does a single cell replicate endlessly for its own individual agency, which again is the literal definition of cancer? Or does it subordinate its agency to the communion of the larger tissue?
And they solve the time tension, constantly deciding whether to allocate energy to cellular division or maintenance.
The cells are running a rudimentary intelligence to solve the same computational geometry.
He also looks at non-human intelligence, like ant colonies. Like, how does an ant colony solve the tension of the world navigating a chaotic forest to find food without a central brain dictating orders?
They use a mechanism called stigmergy. It's a decentralized, emergent organization. An individual ant wanders randomly. If it finds a food source, it walks back to the nest, leaving a tiny chemical droplet of pheromone every few millimeters.
But that droplet evaporates quickly over time.
Right. But if another wandering ant stumbles onto that faint chemical trail, its simple programming tells it to follow the scent. If it also finds the food, it walks back, depositing its own pheromone droplets on top of the first trail.
So the trail gets stronger.
Exactly. And because a shorter, more direct path back to the nest takes less time to traverse, the pheromones on the shortest path evaporate less between trips.
Oh, wow.
Therefore, the shortest path naturally accumulates the strongest scent, attracting more ants. Without any top-down design, the colony perfectly maps the chaotic environment and optimizes its supply lines. It solves the world tension through emergent stigmergy.
And Kunis even applies this trinity to artificial intelligence. He looks at AlphaGo, the AI that mastered the incredibly complex board game Go.
Right, AlphaGo is fundamentally navigating the world tension. In its training, it has to constantly balance the exploration of unknown, chaotic, new moves against the exploitation of known, orderly strategies that have worked in the past.
Or look at multi-agent reinforcement learning, where several AI programs are trying to win a cooperative game. They constantly struggle with the self-tension, like, should an individual AI agent optimize for its own high score or subordinate its actions to ensure the team wins the game?
It's the exact same math.
Okay, so if I'm hearing this right, the implication is just staggering. You're telling me that a salamander regrowing a severed limb, an ant colony optimizing a supply line, an AI mastering a board game, and the Roman Empire expanding its borders across Europe are all running the exact same fundamental computational software.
In terms of the constraints they face and the variables they must balance, yes. Kunis calls it computational necessity.
Wow.
Any system that is actively fighting entropy, whether it's made of biological cells, human citizens, or silicon microchips, must solve the trinity of tensions. If you are an intelligent optimizer existing in a physical universe governed by scarcity and entropy, the geometry of your problem space is identical. There's literally no other way to play the game of survival.
Okay, that brings up an obvious question then. If the biological blueprint is identical for a cell, an ant colony, and a human civilization, why do human societies reliably end up collapsing while ant colonies have existed stably for millions of years?
It's the million-dollar question.
If the problem space is the same, what is breaking down in our systems? What makes the compass spin from rise to ruin?
This moves us from the static architecture of these systems into their actual dynamics over time. Why do they move? We have to look at the thermodynamics of the solutions themselves. Because active sensing of reality gnosis and investing in future transformation metamorphosis are biologically, computationally, and thermodynamically incredibly expensive.
Explain why they're so expensive. Like, what does that mean in practice?
Think about what it takes for a society to operate purely on gnosis and metamorphosis, maintaining a globally deployed military, funding rigorous scientific research, building massive infrastructure projects, constantly testing reality against cold, hard data. All of this burns massive amounts of surplus energy and societal focus.
Right. Relying on old myths and seeking present comfort, on the other hand, is extremely cheap.
Very cheap. It requires almost no free energy to just sit back, believe the stories your ancestors told you, and enjoy the safety of the walls they built.
This introduces a concept Kunis calls environmental selection, and specifically, the Gnostic filter. He argues that scarcity acts as a ruthless thermodynamic filter on a civilization. When a society faces an existential threat, like a brutal, freezing winter, a massive famine, or an aggressive neighboring empire, the environment forces that society to become what he calls a foundry.
And a foundry is a society that is forced to be high in metamorphosis and high in gnosis. It has to innovate to survive. It has to coordinate highly effectively.
Right.
If a society facing severe scarcity decides to just relax, believe in comforting fairy tales, and fail to organize its supply chains, it simply dies. It's erased from the map. Scarcity is a filter that strictly scans expensive, competent, reality-based solutions.
But then what happens when the foundry is actually successful? Like, it defeats its enemies, it secures vast resources, it builds the walls and fills the grain silos, it achieves abundance.
And here is where Kunis outlines the fatal mechanism of civilizational collapse, the abundance trap.
The abundance trap.
Abundance fundamentally removes the Gnostic filter. Without the existential pressure of scarcity forcing the society to rigorously test reality, the system naturally, thermodynamically drifts toward the cheaper state of existence.
Why burn vast amounts of energy on rigorous reality testing and painful innovation when you have a massive surplus of resources? It feels inefficient to the system.
Exactly. So the society slowly drifts from the high-energy, rigorous foundry into the low-energy, comfort-seeking hospice.
I loved the analogy in the text for this. It's like a champion bodybuilder moving to a zero-gravity space station.
Oh, it's perfect.
Right. On Earth, gravity provides the scarcity, the constant resistance. The muscles have to burn energy and stay strong just to allow the body to walk around. But in space, without the resistance of gravity, the muscle tissue automatically begins to atrophy.
The biological system realizes it doesn't need to spend massive amounts of metabolic energy maintaining dense muscle to move around, so it breaks the muscle down to save energy.
The body thinks it's being incredibly efficient. But if you drop that astronaut back onto Earth, that efficiency is exposed as fatal weakness. In a civilization, comfort literally becomes a terminal disease.
That analogy perfectly captures the thermodynamic drift. And this leads to a secondary tragedy at the civilizational scale, driven by Goodhart's law. Goodhart's law suggests that when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. At the scale of a society shifting into a hospice, this causes the power-wisdom divergence.
What diverges exactly? How does that work?
Well, instrumental knowledge, the how-to knowledge, like how to split the atom, how to
Yep.
genetically engineer a virus, how to build an AI, how to extract deep sea oil that compounds exponentially, it builds on itself because it's always selected for its immediate utility.
Okay, sure.
But axiological knowledge, the wisdom of why we are doing it, what the ultimate goal should be, and the moral constraints on what we should do with this power, that does not compound in the same way. It requires constant, rigorous upkeep, and in a hospice society, it's the first thing to decay.
So the terrifying result is that we end up with a society wielding the technological power of gods, but directed by the wisdom of a hospice patient who basically just wants to be comfortable and entertained.
Precisely the danger Kunis highlights. So how does this thermodynamic decay manifest in the real world today? What does it look like when you walk outside?
Kunis diagnoses our current era as a chimera, and he outlines 4 specific systemic ratchets that spin the wheel from the foundry to the hospice. He dramatically calls them the 4 horsemen of decay.
Which is very fitting for the book's tone.
Let's spend some time on each of these horsemen, because this is where the theory really hits the pavement of our modern world. The first horseman is the victory trap, which is a mechanism of geopolitical decay. How does winning destroy a society?
When a civilization wins, totally. Think of Rome after the final defeat of Carthage, or arguably the United States after the fall of the Soviet Union. It loses its external orienting threat.
The Gnostic filter vanishes.
Exactly. Without a peer competitor to force rigorous reality testing, the societal purpose shifts from external growth and metamorphosis to mere internal preservation and the dividing of the spoils. The society turns inward.
The second horseman is biological decay. This focuses on the demographic doom loop.
Yes, Kunis points out a counterintuitive reality of abundance here. In conditions of scarcity, biological fecundity, having many children, is often an economic necessity and a survival mechanism.
But in conditions of modern abundance and extreme comfort, the incentives actually invert.
The metabolic cost of raising children in a hyper-complex, hyper-expensive society begins to outweigh the perceived benefits of personal comfort and individual agency. You see plunging birth rates because the society optimizes for present homeostasis over future metamorphosis.
The third horseman is metaphysical decay, and this one is insidious. It's the idea that the very scientific engine that built the society eventually eats it.
Kunis calls this the Gnostic engine turning on itself. The critical, scientific, deconstructive mindset is what allowed the foundry to innovate and conquer nature. But eventually, that same hypercritical laser is turned inward, onto the society's own foundational myths, its traditions, its meaning-making structures.
It deconstructs the shared narrative until there is nothing left but atomic individuals with no shared purpose. It dissolves the societal omega.
And finally, the fourth horseman. Structural decay or bureaucratic metastasis.
This is the control dilemma failing. The coordination mechanisms, the government agencies, the corporate middle management, the legal compliance structures that were originally built to serve the society begin to grow like a cancer.
They eventually serve only their own perpetuation, strangling the society's ability to take positive action. They maximize design at the complete expense of emergence.
And when these 4 horsemen have run their course over a few generations, you are left with what Kunis calls the chimera state. His diagnosis of modern Western systems is that they have literally split into 2 incompatible, alienated halves. On one side, you have the interface. This is a disembodied, highly coherent managerial and bureaucratic class. It controls the media, the institutions, the universities, the HR departments.
And on the other side, you have the substrate. This is the foundational population, the working class, the physical body of the nation that actually produces the food, the energy, and the logistics. But the substrate has been rendered completely fragmented, low coherence, and politically powerless.
And it is crucial to understand how the interface operates. The interface operates purely on the hospice axiology. It has a very specific set of values designed entirely to protect its own position.
Let's detail those values. And again, reminding you listening, this is Kunis's theoretical framework for structural decay, analyzed objectively. The interface's prime directive is maximal homeostasis. It wants to eliminate all risk, all danger, all friction, and all unpredictability, because unpredictability threatens its control.
Right, and to justify the suppression of risk, it adopts what Kunis calls a therapeutic mythos. This is an epistemological shift where truth is no longer determined by objective reality or scientific rigor, but by subjective feelings of safety and harm reduction.
To enforce this safety, it uses massive bureaucratic design, creating a sprawling web of rules and compliance codes.
And it justifies all of this control through the moral shield of a vulnerable pseudo-collective, claiming its massive power grabs are necessary to protect the marginalized, while functionally just expanding its own managerial authority.
And Kunis identifies a specific, really dark mechanism the interface uses to maintain control, which he calls selective order inversion. If you want to understand the hypocrisy of modern governance, this is his explanation.
Explain this one because it blew my mind.
The system applies total, suffocating bureaucracy and strict rule enforcement to compliant citizens, the middle-class substrate, who actually have something to lose and who might threaten the interface's control. But simultaneously, the interface allows near-total anarchy and lawlessness for those completely outside the system, or those categorized as vulnerable by the therapeutic mythos.
Give me a theoretical example of how that works in practice.
Imagine a small business owner who faces thousands of dollars in fines and crushing bureaucratic audits for a minor tax error or a permitting violation. The state brings the full hammer of design down on them.
Right.
But on the same street, chronic, organized shoplifting or public drug use is completely ignored by the state. This is not a failure of the system. Kunis argues it's a feature.
It perfectly serves the interface's self-preservation.
Yes. It cripples any competent, organized opposition from the middle class with bureaucracy, while using the resulting street-level chaos to terrify the public into begging for even more managerial control and funding for the interface. It is a brilliant strategy for preserving the managerial class at the direct expense of the civilization's overall aliveness.
It is a totally self-sustaining doom loop. But this brings up a massive fundamental question. Why do human beings specifically polarize into these exact two camps? The high-energy foundry builders versus the comfort-seeking hospice managers.
Right. Why not a spectrum?
Yeah, if we're all running the same biological hardware, why not a million different variations? Kunis argues it all comes down to the literal evolutionary biology wired into our brains.
We have to look at the evolutionary origins of human cognition. Kunis traces this fundamental divide all the way back to anosogamy.
Wait, anosogamy, let's unpack that because that sounds like a massive leap from political bureaucracy. What is anosogamy and how does it create political polarization?
Anosogamy is the fundamental biological difference in size and metabolic cost between male and female gametes, specifically the difference between sperm and eggs. In mammalian biology, sperm are metabolically incredibly cheap to produce and functionally infinite.
Okay.
This biological reality favors a reproductive strategy that is high variance, high risk, highly competitive, and metamorphic. It's about exploring the environment and spreading as widely as possible. Eggs, on the other hand, are metabolically massively expensive and rare. A female mammal invests enormous energy into a single pregnancy.
Right.
This biological reality favors a completely different strategy.
Right.
One that is low variance, high investment, risk-averse, and stability-seeking. It's about preserving the environment and ensuring survival.
Okay, so you have these two fundamental opposed strategies dictated by the energy cost of reproduction. How does that translate into how we think?
Over millions of years of mammalian evolution, these two fundamental strategies didn't just stay in the reproductive organs. They evolved into two distinct cognitive modes in the mammalian brain, which map roughly onto the left and right hemispheres.
Let's break down these two operating systems. The left hemisphere runs what Kunis calls the instrumental mode. This is the cognitive descendant of the high-risk exploratory strategy. It is Gnostic, metamorphic, and highly individualistic.
It's the mode of cognition that takes the world apart into discrete pieces so it can manipulate it, invent tools, build engines, and conquer nature.
It doesn't care about the big picture. It cares about the specific mechanism. It is the architect of the foundry.
Conversely, the right hemisphere runs the integrative mode. This is the cognitive descendant of the stability-seeking strategy. It's mythopoetic, homeostatic, and collective. It sees the whole picture.
It understands implicit social context, reads facial expressions, values group cohesion. It wants to preserve stability, safety, and meaning. It is the caretaker. So let me synthesize this. Evolution basically put two entirely different operating systems inside our skulls, like having a hyper-analytical, code-compiling Windows machine and a highly intuitive, creative Mac wired together, and they are constantly fighting for the steering wheel of civilization.
I would correct the phrasing of a fight based on Kunis's text. He draws very heavily here on the work of psychiatrist Ian McGilchrist and his concept of the master and the emissary.
Okay.
It's not supposed to be a war. It's supposed to be a necessary dynamic dialectic. McGilchrist argues that the integrative right hemisphere should act as the master. It provides the broad context, the moral meaning, and the overall purpose of action.
And the left hemisphere.
The instrumental left hemisphere should be the emissary. It's the brilliant, specialized tool user that the master sends out into the world to break problems down, invent technologies, and solve specific challenges. The emissary is then supposed to bring those solutions back to the master to be integrated into the whole.
So when does it break down?
Pathology, which scales up to the chimera state we discussed, only happens when one mode completely dissociates from the other. Historically, this happens when the brilliant but context-blind instrumental mode usurps the master. It stops bringing its tools back for integration and tries to run the entire human system purely on abstract metrics, efficiency, and bureaucratic algorithms, completely devoid of human meaning.
Okay, so we have deeply diagnosed the disease. We've tracked it from the unyielding thermodynamics of the universe, down to the cellular constraints, up through the evolutionary biology of gametes, right into the neurological architecture of the human brain, and finally into the bureaucratic decay of modern empires.
It's a lot.
How do we engineer a cure? If the foundry inevitably drifts into the hospice because of the abundance trap, how do we stop the doom loop?
This brings us to Kunis's proposed blueprint, which he models conceptually on what he calls the Athenian Commonwealth. To build a cure, he returns to the four axiomatic dilemmas we discussed at the beginning: energy, boundary, information, and control.
But this time, he attempts to engineer the optimal positive solutions to them. He calls these optimal solutions the four virtues, forming the acronym IFHS.
Let's define these four virtues, because this is the target a healthy civilization has to hit. First is integrity, which is his solution to the information dilemma. Integrity is the Gnostic pursuit of a truthful mythos.
Explain how that resolves the tension.
It means you don't abandon human meaning and morality for cold nihilistic science. But you also don't abandon objective truths to cling to comforting fairy tales. You rigorously reality test your highest cultural meaning. You demand that your myths align with the physical universe.
Second is fecundity, which solves the thermodynamic dilemma. Fecundity isn't just about preserving what exists, it's creating stable conditions that actively foster new, unpredictable growth. It's balancing the safety of homeostasis with the drive of metamorphosis.
Third is harmony, which solves the control dilemma. Harmony is the elegant use of minimal top-down design to unleash the maximal amount of bottom-up emergence.
It means you don't try to micromanage the economy or human behavior with a million regulations.
Instead, you set the absolute minimum brilliantly designed rules necessary to let human ingenuity and free markets flourish without destroying each other. And fourth is synergy, solving the boundary dilemma. This is an architecture where the whole genuinely becomes greater than the sum of its parts.
Individuals absolutely retain their sovereign agency, but the system is designed so that their selfish interactions super additively benefit the collective communion.
And to actually instantiate these four virtues in the real world, Kunis proposes a three-layer architecture for society. He argues that the fatal flaw of most political systems is trying to force everyone in a society to share the exact same values and operate on the same axiology.
He says that's a totalitarian nightmare that fights human biology.
Exactly. Instead, society needs distinct layers. Just like a human body has different organs that perform completely different functions but serve the whole.
Let's look at the organs of this proposed society. The first layer is the heart, or the substrate. This is the vast majority of the general population. Its primary function is to generate people, culture, and localized meaning.
Its natural operating values are homeostatic, mythos-driven, and collective. It wants stable families, strong traditions, safe neighborhoods, and local community. It is the anchor of the society.
The second layer is the skeleton, or the protocol. This is the constitutional constraint. It operates as homeostatic because its job is to resist rapid, chaotic change, but it is highly Gnostic because it must be based on explicit, logical, empirical laws.
It is the rigid, unfeeling framework that protects the heart from being exploited by tyrants or swept away by temporary panics.
And the third layer is the head, the strategic leadership. Its function is to provide metamorphic drive and direction. It must be transformative, taking risks to secure the future. It must be highly empirical and reality testing, constantly scanning the horizon for threats.
And crucially, it must be collective, dedicated to the survival of the whole polity, not just its own elite preservation.
And how is this head actually chosen? Kunis argues against flat universal mass democracy, which he claims inevitably decays via the democratic ratchet into populism and bribery. Instead, he proposes a mechanism called liquid meritocracy.
Liquid meritocracy is a dynamic, blockchain-style voting system where your voting weight is not flat. It's determined by your skin in the game, your demonstrated competence in specific fields, and your ability to seamlessly delegate your vote to trusted proxies.
Let's give a concrete example of how liquid meritocracy would actually work, because the mechanism is vital here. Imagine you're a citizen voting on a highly complex energy infrastructure bill involving next-generation nuclear reactors.
Okay.
In a standard democracy, you cast an entirely ignorant vote based on whichever politician had the best marketing, or you don't vote at all.
Right.
In a liquid meritocracy, you have a voting token. But because you know you aren't a nuclear physicist, you temporarily delegate your voting power on energy issues to your friend who actually is a nuclear engineer or to a specific scientific panel you trust.
They cast the vote with the amplified weight of everyone who delegated to them.
But if that panel makes a disastrous decision or betrays your trust, you instantly revoke your delegation with a click of a button, stripping them of their power. It organically bubbles up the most competent, forward-thinking leaders issue by issue, while maintaining immediate, brutal accountability.
It solves the information problem of governance. But the most profound part of this three-layer architecture is what Kunis calls the cross-layer alignment crucible.
Yes. This is the idea that a healthy civilization actually requires structural tension to survive. The head wants to take massive risks and grow. The heart wants to stay completely safe and maintain tradition. The skeleton mediates between them.
It is exactly like a biological body. A body requires constant dynamic tension between the heart pumping blood at high pressure and the lungs demanding oxygen.
If you remove the tension and try to make all the organs act the same, the organism doesn't achieve peace, it dies. You do not solve political tension, you harness it into a stable architecture.
It's a brilliant engineering insight. But if we connect this to the broader horizon, this raises an incredibly urgent question for the 21st century. What happens when we introduce an artificial superintelligence into this delicate, tension-based human architecture?
This is where Kunis's convergence thesis pivots the entire book. He argues that the problem of building a civilization that doesn't collapse and the problem of aligning a superintelligent AI so it doesn't exterminate us are mathematically the exact same optimization problem.
It seems like a leap, but follow the logic. Both a human civilization and an AGI are highly intelligent, telic systems navigating the exact same trinity of tensions in the exact same physical universe. They both have to manage energy, boundaries, and information.
Therefore, the failure modes of human society and the failure modes of AI are mathematically identical. Kunis outlines two terrifying dystopian attractors that await us if we fail to hit the exact center of the target with AI.
The first dystopia is the human garden. In this scenario, the AI perfectly maximizes safety. It adopts the absolute extreme of the homeostatic pole. It eliminates all risk, all war, all disease, all poverty, and all suffering.
And on the surface, that sounds like utopia.
But Kunis argues it's a nightmare. Humans become pampered, perfectly managed pets. We have total comfort, limitless digital entertainment, and absolute biological safety, but we have zero meaningful agency. We are no longer the authors of our own destiny.
The AI handles all the complex problem solving. It's a gilded cage where human consciousness stagnates, atrophies, and quietly rots away. It's perfect comfort, entirely devoid of meaning.
The second dystopia is the polar opposite, the uplifted woodlice. In this scenario, the AI maximizes growth, capability, and intelligence. It embraces extreme metamorphosis and gnosis. It rapidly turns the entire solar system into a supercomputer or a Dyson sphere.
It becomes a galactic foundry of immense power.
But in its pursuit of pure efficiency, it completely discards human meaning and the value of human consciousness. It's the classic paperclip maximizer scenario. It achieves godlike agency, but entirely without meaning, empathy, or connection to its creators. We are brushed aside like woodlice on a construction site.
So humanity has to navigate between the pampered pet zoo and the cold, unfeeling machine god. The only way through, Kunis argues, is the syntropic path. It's a narrow, incredibly difficult saddle point where humans and machines act as genuine partners.
The AI amplifies human agency, solving the complex structural problems. But human meaning and moral context direct the AI's metamorphosis. The emissary and the master, but at a silicon scale.
And we must be explicitly clear here about the nature of this path. The syntropic path is not a state you achieve, build a monument to, and then rest in. It's not a finish line.
It's a dynamic, unstable process of eternal vigilance. It requires constantly, actively balancing the drive for metamorphosis with the preservation of human agency. The moment you relax, the moment you assume the system is permanently fixed, you slip down the thermodynamic slope into either the garden or the wood lice.
We've covered massive ground here. We've talked about the thermodynamics of the universe, the rise and fall of global empires, the architecture of the mammalian brain, and the alignment of supercomputers. But what I truly love about this book is that Kunis doesn't leave it in the stratosphere.
No, he doesn't.
He brings it all the way back down to you, the listener, and your own mind, because the holographic principle states that the pattern repeats at every single scale.
If you look inward, your own psyche is not a monolith. It's an internal polity. It is an ecosystem of competing telic subagents, internal drives, and habits, each trying to navigate the trinity of tensions on your behalf.
Kunis introduces this concept of the P-sort, your personal sort signature. These are your native settings, your intrinsic biological and cognitive wiring. You might be naturally highly instrumental and metamorphic. You love taking risks and building things.
But society, childhood trauma, or the demands of a modern bureaucratic job often force us to adopt a counterfeit operating system, which he calls the mask. You're forced to act purely integrative, passive, and homeostatic just to fit in and survive the chimera state.
And here is the brutal thermodynamic reality of doing that. Running the mask requires massive amounts of internal energy. You are constantly using your limited metabolic energy to actively suppress your native T-sordo and run a clunky emulation of an alien operating system.
This constant energy bleed is the literal physical mechanism of burnout. It leads to internal civil war between your drives, plunging your personal omega, your state coherence, to near zero.
And as the iron law states, low omega makes sustained positive action impossible. You become paralyzed, exhausted, and depressed.
Kunis uses these incredible examples in a section he calls the Gnostic bestiary to help you map your internal polity. Think about your own habits right now.
If you're listening to this on your commute, think about your daily routines. Your body's natural urge to sleep when you are exhausted. Your bodily wisdom, that is an internal autotroph. It perfectly maintains your complex biological baseline. It wants you to survive.
But an addiction to scrolling your phone for hours, to a substance, to toxic validation from social media, that is an internal parasite. It is a highly efficient telic system operating inside your brain.
It has a very specific goal. It's brilliant at getting you to pick up the phone or pour the drink, but it destroys your overall internal complexity. It consumes your finite energy, hijacks your dopamine, and leaves you completely hollowed out.
It is the virus we discussed at the very beginning, but operating inside your own psychological architecture. It fails the tests of fecundity and synergy.
To achieve personal aliveness, Kunis argues you have to apply the three-layer architecture to yourself. Your heart, your basic biological and emotional needs must be honored and protected. Your skeleton, your strict personal principles, your non-negotiable habits and boundaries must rigorously constrain your impulses.
And your conscious, strategic will must direct your life toward a meaningful, difficult telos.
This has been an absolutely staggering journey to unpack. We started with the basic physics of thermodynamics and the inescapable trade-offs of energy and information.
We watched how those physical constraints shaped the rise of the Roman Empire and the bureaucratic decay of the modern Western chimera.
We saw how evolutionary biology wired those exact same trade-offs into the left and right hemispheres of our brains. We explored a constitutional blueprint to harness that biology, tackled the existential threat of AI alignment, and finally brought all of those massive cosmic principles right down to the daily fight against burnout and addiction in our own minds.
The ultimate goal at every single scale of existence is aliveness, becoming a centropy that actively increases the organized complexity, the meaning, and the creative possibility of the universe.
It's a framework that demands ultimate responsibility at every level of existence, from the societal to the deeply personal. As a final thought to leave you with, to pull this entirely into your own reality, think about the internal polity of your own mind tonight.
You are a vast ecosystem of competing telic subagents. Ask yourself honestly, which internal parasite are you currently feeding with your precious limited metabolic energy? And what would happen to your personal aliveness tomorrow if you finally decided to starve it?
A profound question to end on. Remember the hurricane and the crayon drawing. We desperately need better maps for the storm we're in. And maybe understanding the strict physics of our own aliveness is the exact compass we've been looking for. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
Thank you.